handheld mic, and I'll use it. Test. There we go. And thank you, Matt, for those wonderful words and kind words. Also, and I'd just like to say that while the series, the Marek series, is extraordinary in its design, the vision of the family, and I want to also say that the series does pay for the artists and their visits, but the exhibitions are supported by the Friends of the Gallery. So you too can play a role by becoming a friend of the gallery. We have a schedule and a summary of last year's activities available outside the lecture room, and a card if you would wish to take it home with you. Consider becoming a friend of the gallery in the future. But tonight I'm really pleased to be able to stand here and do the introduction for our artists, the beginning of the 5th year of the Marek Visiting Artists series. 2 figurative painters, 2 exhibitions of figurative art. And of course, the human figure has a long history as a subject in art. The Roman author and philosopher Pliny, who lived between 23 and 79 AD, the origin of painting remains obscure, but all agree that it began by tracing the contour of a human shadow. And despite the variety of functions of figurative work and portraiture, from remembrance and immortality to historical record and social statement, it's through the contemplation of others that we understand ourselves as human beings. And I think we have 2 excellent exhibitions that operate in that fashion. And these exhibitions are by artists who not only exemplify contemporary figurative painting, but are actively engaged in defining that genre through the production of their work. First to come to the stage tonight is Rose Freymuth-Frazier. Rose is a native of Nevada City, California, who now lives and works in New York City. She attended the Art Student League of New York from 2002 to 2004 and studied privately with Stephen Assail in New York City from 2002 to 2005. She also studied with the Norwegian Odd Nerdrum in 2005. Her work has been featured in exhibitions in both the United States and in Europe, and she is currently represented by Ann Nathan Gallery. It's a great pleasure, Rose, to welcome you to the stage tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. This is a real privilege. I don't do much lecturing or teaching because I'm painting usually. So it's really nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me and having me talk about my work. When I started looking at how to approach this lecture, I thought about maybe almost going at it like a mini retrospective, because I feel like I've sort of completed a body of work that I began painting, well, about 10 years ago, honestly. My studies began 8 years ago, but I was painting before that with very little training. But what struck me looking back on it is that I think there's been this sort of singular vision that I had, that I think a lot of artists have, and you'll see in Michael's work too. It's just there's some kind of motivating vision, or I don't know what else they call it, that drives somebody to paint very often. And so I noticed, looking back on the work that I started in 2000, before I had any training, that it basically correlated with the work that I'm doing now. So I decided to include some pieces from that time period, which are poorly painted, but interesting in the sense that I also included paintings that were painted much later that sort of correlate. So I was living in Southern California around this time period and traveling through Latin America, Mexico, and Guatemala, and Argentina, and obviously influenced by the Southern California influence. And I would go and get pieces of wood out of the garbage and paint on them in acrylic. And this is a piece that I did then. It's pretty large. Most of the pieces in this lecture are life size. If I'll let you know otherwise, but almost all of them are. This is larger than life. And this is a piece I did in 2008, which I thought sort of was a natural progression of that first piece. This is an Indonesian dancer in New York City, but the same kind of exotic feel, same composition. This is another piece from much earlier. You can tell it's on a piece of wood that has a hole in it. It was painted in acrylic. And then in 2008, I painted this piece, Adrian. I lived above a hair salon in New York, and that was a very common image, very kind of urban image, and so I wanted to paint that as just kind of natural sort of female expression. Another early piece, and then a few years later, in the dorm, which is in the show. And I didn't realize any of this until after the fact, obviously. The old paintings had lived under my bed for about 8 years, and I moved a couple years ago and pulled them out, and then when I was preparing for this, I thought, it's kind of interesting to look back on the work and see how there really is a through line. This is the last of the early pieces. I had forgotten all about this painting, but the fish was obviously interesting me pretty early on because we also have this piece, which is in the show, Woman Caught Fishing. And this painting is, I'll talk more about it later, but it's something about self-sufficiency and, you know, if you teach a man to fish, that sort of theme. So this is kind of smack dab in the middle of the 10-year period I'm talking about. I was painting a lot of fish at this point. I think it's William Merritt Chase who said, paint a fish every day and you'll learn how to paint. And I was painting fish before I heard that, but I always liked that idea. And I used to go to Chinatown and pick out a fish that was very picturesque and take it home and paint it, and it would melt and rot and stink, and I'd put it in the freezer and try to keep it in the position that it was in and bring it out again and paint it some more. So I actually hung this from my ceiling every time I painted it, and it dripped and smelled. I even didn't have air conditioning one summer, and I was using a mask. I don't know really what I was doing. I painted a lot of fish. So in 2002, I started studying with Ray Kreuz's artists. So I included just a couple pieces from this period. This is already a couple years into the training, but it just shows the evolution of the technique. And this is not life-size, it's a small study. And this is also from that period. You can tell that I'm still kind of clunky. The face and proportions and stuff are getting there, but it's a little bit crude. And the still life elements are things sort of from my life. I had a pet rat when I was little, and she died, and I loved her, so I put her on my head. And I included this piece because it's totally fabricated. I had decided that I was after something of a mood more than letting the features of the model dictate the painting. I wanted to create the mood and create the painting around the mood. So I made this up from what I knew about form and what I wanted to create in a painting. That's a particular feeling I wanted to create in the painting, so this is totally fabricated. Everything else at this point is done from life. I'll try to remember to point out when I started to work from photographs too. So in 2005, I went to Norway to study with Odd Nerdrum, and that was a really great experience. It's very fanciful. The world he's set up there. It's on the North Sea, and very welcoming, and there's goats and miniature ponies pulling carriages, and we go fishing every day from the North Sea and pull up the fish and gut them, and well, I didn't gut them, but we'd eat them, and we made hay, we turned hay in the fields, and it was all very charming. And I learned a lot just watching him. That's the way he teaches. He doesn't really teach. He just can watch. And I modeled for him a fair amount. And this piece I was using what I knew of his palette and trying to kind of think about what I was getting from him there. So a lot of these grays and stuff are very typical of Nerdrum's palette. This is just another quick study from that time. And when I got back, I painted this because I wanted to do something of like a graduation piece. I wanted to see what I had learned from my time there and how I could apply it to a painting. So the whole point of this painting was to basically mimic what I'd learned from Nerdrum. And again, he had this very special gray that he used. He said one day he picked up, he never washed his brushes. No one ever washed their brushes there. So he would stick them in oil, and he said one day he picked them up and he saw the color at the bottom of the oil can, and that was, the color of all colors. And you see it in his paintings a lot. He smears it around because it's kind of a warm, cool, it's sort of a special color. So later he learned to mix it, and we mixed it too, but that was what that gray is, and I was using his palette totally, and his palette knife work and stuff like that. So this was, for me, my own kind of graduation piece to see what I had learned. So right around now, I had started what I consider, after the fact, my first kind of body of work, and this is the largest piece from that time. It's life size. What I was thinking about mostly, this is kind of when I started painting people in my world and friends of mine, and tried to be very kind of true to not bringing in outside elements, just bringing people who were around me into my paintings and letting them kind of dictate the paintings. And the two women on the bottom are sisters, and they're very good friends of mine. And the bottom one was pregnant with her first child, and it was kind of the first child in this generation. And so I painted this piece as sort of, I also am from the Pacific Northwest, so there's a lot of totem imagery and stuff. So it's sort of a totem storytelling, family, the protection of the next generation, and that kind of idea. I also like the idea of a six-armed creature that somehow was one beast. And there's the baby. And these fascinated me. This is the first time I ever saw breast pumps, and I think they're amazing. They're so bizarre. And also, obviously, what it means for her. She's an emergency room doctor in the Bronx, and she's also a mother. And so, this is what it is to be a doctor and to have a profession and also be a mother. And so she was using breast pumps, and they were worth painting in my mind. This is just another piece from that period. So from 2004 to 2006, I studied with Stephen Assail. I was his assistant privately at his studio and for his private classes. And Stephen is an amazing technician, so I learned a lot just about draftsmanship and that kind of stuff, really technical stuff from him. And I included some drawings just from that period. And this one I included in particular because I did something similar to the Boy with a Pearl painting, where I made a painting based on this drawing, but I didn't use the model at any point other than just for the initial drawing. And I wanted to see what, it sort of frees up the approach. It almost becomes slightly formulaic in the sense that I'm making up my lights and shadows, and but I liked the idea of removing myself a little bit from the original source for the painting. So this is the drawing, and then this is the resulting painting. And I included this just because it's a study from my time with Stephen, which you can really see what his emphasis was. There's a lot about color and form and structure, and there's like a ton of color in there. And so that was really what I got from him and what he does really well. That, by the way, was not life size. That was a study also. This is just a drawing from that time, using some of his materials and approach. Same thing, portrait studies. This begins something of another series that I painted around this time. I decided to do a series of portraits of women who I thought deserved to be painted. I think very often subjects of portrait paintings are people who are paying to be painted, heads of things, and usually old white guys. So I thought I'd paint some women that I thought were worthy of being painted and would never actually have their portrait painted otherwise. And this is Paige. She's a dancer, and she's just kind of an amazing, eccentric person who has a giant loft in Brooklyn, which is filled with, it's like a museum, it's filled with prosthetic limbs and pieces of farm equipment, and she's just created this world. It's slightly famous in that area. And this is Audrey. She's in a lot of my paintings. I find her very inspiring. She's a good friend of mine, and she's also a metalsmith. She has her own business in New York. She's very complicated as a person, and I find that interesting to paint. She's at once masculine in the sense she works with her hands, she's very strong, and yet she's also very feminine. She has a huge collection of Berber jewelry and North African jewelry, and that's also really fun to paint. So I paint her very often in her collection. She's also she does furniture restoration, and has made metal bikinis for Jennifer Lopez and things like that. So she's doing it. And I think the day she came over to sit for this, she had found out that her boyfriend was going to jail for a long time. So there's something of that in the portrait, which is also something I hope to capture. He's out now. This is Karina, and she lived downstairs from me. She was a Mexican immigrant, and she's here illegally. And her son had cerebral palsy, and she had a lot to deal with, and she was doing it. She would drag him up and down the stairs, and she was very kind and sweet with him, and she never complained and seemed to be doing just fine. But I looked at her and thought, that must be pretty hard. So I wanted to paint a portrait of her. And Keishi is a belly dance impresario of sorts. She built a huge belly dance network around the world with troops all over, and has made it a pretty big thing. And I thought that was kind of impressive. It kind of just shows you can do whatever you set out to do. This is the beginning of these standing figures that I painted around this period. And I was really trying to keep the narrative aspects within the context of the figure. Every prop, for lack of a better word, was meant to tell a story of the figure, but I wanted it to be contained within the figure and not have anything really outside of that. So this is the first in that piece. And of course she's something of an Eve character as well, kind of the rejection of, whatever we blame Eve for. Woman caught fishing from the show, you might already know it. As I said, it was a self-sufficiency allegory, I guess. Teach a woman to fish, and she's got food for life. It's the same idea. It's a sister piece to Woman Caught Fishing. Sarah Bat, it's Sarah who you saw in Sextopus, and she's in quite a few of my paintings. Not all of them are in the lecture, but Sarah, I painted this when her boyfriend of 9 years had left her via email after she went off to law school. And she was really pissed off. So I painted the painting, but she's better now. She's a lawyer and she doesn't care anymore. It was a while ago. And with Spring Sisters, it's actually Audrey and her sister Elizabeth. I spoke about this before. I think, it's mostly about families and heritage and sort of the cycle of one's history, and how you also at some point become somebody else's history. I wanted the idea of the urns behind them to represent their past and the present, but at some point they too will be the past. And that in some ways their bond, they have the family bond that's unbreakable, and all the things that go along with that, with being in one family. all the things that people know in one family that other people don't know. And this is just a variation on that, just good girl acting bad. Feather Duster was sort of meant to be, I was thinking about domesticity and how, I don't want to stereotype at all because some people lead very happy domestic lives. I think that's totally valid. But that in some ways, some aspects of that could become so redundant and so you could become very empty that you would almost need to feed off of something that it wasn't enough to play this very typical role. And I know it's a typical, sort of stereotypical idea that women are dusting and cleaning and taking care of kids, so I don't want to go there. I recognize that as potentially stereotypical, but that was the idea, that if you are falling into that space, if I were falling into that space, I would probably feel very empty. This is just a straight portrait of a woman I know who's a dancer who's in her 50s, and she's made kind of a splash on the dance scene in New York City for 30 years or something. So I painted these objects, disposable plastic objects. I thought they were fascinating, they're fun to paint. And the shoes were, first of all, like I said, really interesting to paint. And also I love the idea of who wore these shoes, where have they been, what have they been doing, they tell a story potentially, and I like that open-endedness a lot. And I like the idea of something plastic being rendered in oil paint. These shoes I dragged around for about 10 years. I bought them when I was a teenager at a thrift store and they never fit me, but I couldn't bear to part with them. So when I learned to paint, I decided to paint them instead. I think I still have them. I wish I had the painting instead of the shoes, but painting's long gone now. And this is, I have a friend who works for Cynthia Nixon, so she got a lot of fancy shoes, and I thought it was better to paint them than to wear them. So this is a fancy shoe, apparently. And again, just the idea of plastics and oil, something about that I find very appealing. The impermanent and the semi-permanent. And Audrey, again, this was really meant to illustrate this two aspects of her as a woman, that she's muscly and tattooed and, all of that, and yet she's putting on her lipstick and getting ready to go out somewhere or another. I find that very appealing in general, and I think a lot of my work is based on that duality, masculine and feminine. And here she is again as something of a contemporary Eve, clothed, post-Eden clothed Eve. There's 3 paintings in this series. They're more decorative and straightforward as portrait paintings. Cigar smoker. I like the idea of this kind of urban character being very whimsical. Band dancer, it's just the Indonesian dancer again. And this is the last I have, I think, of the standing figures. You can't see here, but she has mom tattooed in Old English on her shoulder and has brass knuckles around her neck, and it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, mad housewife, or housewife gone nuts. So the following 3 paintings are in the show also, and they're meant as something serious. I painted them almost as mug shots because I didn't want to objectify the models at all. So I feel like if they're really frontal and slightly confrontational, it's almost like you have to deal with them one-on-one. So each piece has its own particular message or whatever. But it was also a little bit of hear no evil, see no evil. This one is more about maybe suffering some kind of humiliation with strength and fighting through that. And there's Sarah again. She's a lawyer, so I put the tape on. And caregiver is also in the show. This was just simply thinking about who is a caregiver, who does that role fall on? Very often it's women, and it's not usually by choice either for sick relatives or children, or, you know, that's usually who ends up in that position. And whether you like to, or whether you wanted it or not, and people usually rise to the occasion. I think that would be difficult. I think that's a challenge, and a lot of people, tons of people, end up in that position. So that's kind of what I was thinking about with this piece. And again, party favor is something of some kind of humiliation, but it really actually being okay. You know, she's making light of it. And Asia, when I do pieces like this, I'm trying to keep in mind the model a fair amount. So what I wanted to do with this was have her scantily clad and have her, you know, the way she's dressed, but keep her face and her energy very neutral. There's not an embarrassment there, and there's not, you know, there's nothing weird going on for her about it. She's totally open and she's accessible, and it's just what it is, and it's okay. Girl rescue. Just that. I painted this after I saw the sleeping hermaphrodite at the Louvre, and it's a 2nd century Roman sculpture. It's beautiful, and it's probably made after a Greek sculpture that doesn't exist anymore. But it was so tender and so sensitive and accessible. There's nothing, you know, shocking about it. It's they're right in the middle of the Louvre. There's hundreds of people walking around it, and I thought it was really a successful piece of art. There's something that seemed very universal about it, and I love that idea of people being balanced in their masculinity and their femininity. So this is an overt expression of that, obviously, but I wanted to keep it as gentle and as soft as, or at least attempt that, as I felt the sculpture was. This is the stimulus package. It's just that. She has her American flag bikini, and I painted this when all of that was happening, and it was this idea of this incessant need for the cash injection in our economy, or in capitalism in general, the structure that we live under, that it's just this reverence for cash. So this is the largest painting I've done so far. It's about 90-something inches by 64 inches. And I couldn't stay away from the breast pumps when Eliza had her second baby, so that's her second baby repeated several times. And I think I was thinking that I would feel like I had 1,000 babies after me if I had even, you know, 2 the way she does. So they're all needing something from her, and she's able to give it. And Hounded, I recently completed. The idea, I was looking again at a lot of Botticelli and thinking about Venus and beauty and what that means. And I was thinking about the, I guess, the desire for that, and also the repulsion in that. You know, the desire for being wanted, and also the repulsion in that. So there's this feeling of needing that and also rejecting it. And this is the last painting I painted. I just finished it pretty recently, and I've eliminated everything. It's the most bare, kind of spare painting, and I think in a way it might be the most sort of human. And I can see how it's gone full circle from the first work that was very simple busts to this. I sort of feel like it's some kind of strange conclusion that I've eliminated everything else, and in a way I feel like this tells more of a story about humanity than any of it. So now I'm just sort of thinking about when you've exhausted your particular vision, what does one do next? So that's sort of where I'm at now, and figuring out what the next step is, because I feel like this is sort of a completion of a period in time. That's it.